When people talk about Ukrainian literature, they often talk about land, history, suffering, survival. They rarely talk about desire, and almost never about queerness, especially when it comes to the so-called classics. But queerness doesn't begin when a culture finds a word for it. It begins when a person realizes they don't fit and has no language to explain why. More than 100 years ago, Ukrainian literature created a protagonist who was too sensitive, too introspective, too inward for the world around him. His difference was treated as a moral flaw, his loneliness as a personal failure. Today, we might recognize something else. In this episode, we are not rewriting a classic through a modern lens. We are reading what was already there, between the lines. This is the story of a queer Ukrainian protagonist who was never allowed to be named as such. A story about identity before identity had a vocabulary. About desire without permission. About a country that didn't yet know how to read him. This is Ukraine Between the Lines, and this is Ukraine's forgotten queer protagonist. First, I would like to take a moment to explain why this podcast exists and who it is for. Ukraine Between the Lines is a podcast for people who want to understand Ukraine, not just what is happening here, but who we are. I'm doing this because Ukraine is often described from the outside in very simple terms, as a place of war, as a headline, as a symbol. But Ukraine is not simple, and it's never been. Our identity is layered, contradictory, sometimes uncomfortable, and best understood not through explanations, but through stories. That's why this podcast is built around books. Ukrainian literature holds experiences that are difficult to translate into quick facts. How we relate to land and family, how silence works in our culture, how desire and fear shape everyday life, how people learn to survive emotionally in conditions that don't offer many safe choices. When I say between the lines, I mean the space where Ukrainian writers had to hide what they couldn't say directly, and where readers today can finally notice it. This podcast isn't meant to be a guide or a lesson. It's an invitation to read Ukrainian literature not as something exotic or historical, but as something deeply human and surprisingly familiar. My hope is that these conversations will help listeners outside Ukraine see our culture in its full complexity. Not idealized, not reduced to suffering, but honest. And maybe after listening, you'll want to open one of these books yourself. Not to learn Ukraine, but to meet it. Slowly, imperfectly, and on its own terms. One book at a time. And today we are opening the work of Ahatanhel Krymskyi, a writer whose voice feels surprisingly intimate. His novel explores self-identity under pressure in a time when difference had to remain unspoken. To understand the novel of Ahatanhel Krymskyi, which is called Andrii Lahovskyi, we need to place it at a very specific moment in cultural history. At the beginning of the 20th century, Ukrainian literature was undergoing a quiet but radical transformation. Traditional patriarchal hierarchies were beginning to crack, not loudly, not through manifestos, but through inner life. Ahatanhel Krymskyi wrote what is often described as the first Ukrainian intellectual novel, and it did something unprecedented. It shifted attention away from land, community, and duty, and turn it inward, toward the body, desire, psyche, and spiritual crisis. This was the age of early modernism. Across Europe, Victorian moral certainties were collapsing. The idea of what counted as normal, psychologically, sexually, and even spiritually, was being re-examined. New theories were entering culture. Psychoanalysis began to speak about the unconscious, medicine started redefining mental illness, and literature became one of the few places where these tensions could be explored. But in Ukrainian culture, this process was especially fraught. Ukraine did not exist as an independent state. Ukrainian language and culture were marginalized. Intellectuals lived under imperial pressure, political, cultural, and moral. In such conditions, difference was simply dangerous. There was no acceptable language for non-normative desire, no framework for queerness as identity. Sexuality existed, but it was either medicalized, moralized, or silenced. Ahatanhel Krymsky's novel emerges precisely at this crossroads. It introduces what the researcher Aheva calls as new sensibility, a modernist attention to inner fracture, nervousness, exhaustion, and alienation. The protagonist's quote-unquote illness is not just personal, it becomes a metaphor for the culture itself. At the turn of the century, conditions like neurasthenia were widely discussed. They were seen not simply as medical diagnoses, but as symptoms of a historical moment, a civilization in transition. In the novel Andrii Lahovskyi, physical illness and psychological instability are carefully distinguished. Epilepsy is treated as degeneration of the body. Neurasthenia, on the other hand, is framed as a condition of culture, of heightened sensitivity, excess reflection, and emotional overload. This distinction matters. It tells us that what the novel portrays as weakness was in fact a modern form of perception, one that did not fit patriarchal expectations of masculinity, productivity, or emotional restraint. Modernism, unlike positivist realism, was interested in precisely these unstable states: obsession, longing, ambivalence, forbidden desire. It questioned the idea that health meant conformity. At the same time, cultural discourse often treated such sensitivity as degeneration. Medicine acted almost like a form of moral police. Clinics were places of control, not understanding. In this context, writing openly about desire, especially same-sex desire, was not simply taboo, it was dangerous. Ahatanhel Krymskyi knew this broader European context very well. He was deeply educated, multilingual, immersed in classical antiquity and contemporary thought. He was writing in the shadow of events like the trial of Oscar Wilde, a moment that demonstrated how brutally society could punish what it refused to name. And yet, instead of open rebellion, the novel Andrii Lahovskyi offers something quieter. It shows how a person internalizes prohibition, how desire turns into self-surveillance, how intimacy becomes something to be explained away as friendship, philosophy, or moral struggle. This is why queerness in this novel does not appear as identity or pride. It appears as tension, as exhaustion, as a constant effort to discipline the self. Understanding this historical and cultural context helps us to see the novel more clearly. What might once have been read as hysteria, decadence, or moral failure begins to look like something else entirely. A modern subject caught between desire and prohibition, between culture and repression, between the need to be oneself and the need to survive. This is not just a story of one character. It is a portrait of a culture learning painfully how to speak about what it had long been forced to silence. To understand why Andrii Lahovskyi feels like a queer figure, we first need to understand his story. The novel begins with rupture. Andrii is a young student who decides to emotionally break with his mother. He looks at her and sees everything he does not want to be: simplicity, tradition, emotional directness, lack of refinement. He calls himself a decadent, a neurasthenic, a child of the end of the century, and her a woman who does not even have the quote-unquote privilege of nervous illness. This first conflict is important. It is not just about a mother and a son. It is about a young man trying to cut himself away from a world that feels too narrow for his inner life. Years pass. Andrii becomes a respected professor, a poet, an intellectual, and then he meets the Schmidts family. The Schmidts are a general, his wife, and their sons. Young, beautiful, educated, full of vitality. They invite Andrii to spend the summer with them in Tuapse by the Black Sea. This summer becomes the emotional center of the novel. Four men walking together, talking about poetry, philosophy, music, Greece, beauty, swimming, writing, admiring landscapes and each other. Nothing explicitly sexual happens, and yet everything feels charged. The atmosphere is full of admiration, tenderness, idealization, and emotional closeness. The Schmidts admire Andrii's intellect. Andrii worships their youth, purity, and beauty. Their relationship resembles a classical Greek dialogue more than a modern friendship, a space where male beauty, intellect, and emotional intimacy are allowed to exist without being named. This is where the homoeroticism of the novel lives, not in acts, but in structure, in looks, in devotion, in the way Andrii places these young men above himself. He does not simply love them, he serves them. He needs their approval, their presence, their attention. And when the summer ends, everything collapses. Back in Moscow, Andrii enters a period of isolation and asceticism. He withdraws from people, he fasts, he reads religious texts, he tries to discipline his body and his mind. This shift is crucial because it feels less like spiritual growth and more like repression. The novel repeatedly describes heterosexual sex as something dirty, exhausting, degrading, something that leaves the body broken and empty. This is not simply moralism, it feels like a person forcing himself into a role that does not belong to him. At the same time, Andrii continues to idealize the Schmidts, even when he begins to notice their selfishness and manipulation. His loyalty does not disappear, his devotion only becomes more painful. Critics describe this novel as deeply platonic, not in the romantic sense, but in the philosophical one. Love here is a path toward truth, but a truth that cannot fully enter the body. The body remains the problem. Desire remains suspended. Queerness in this novel is not declared, it is lived as tension, as self-control, as longing without permission, and the ending only strengthens this tragedy. Andrii returns to his mother. He believes he will finally be loved as he is. It is a tender ending, but also a deeply compromised one, because he is accepted not as a desiring subject, but as a respectable, successful, disciplined man. This is why Andrii Lahovskyi is not a revolutionary queer novel. It is a novel about queerness before it had a future, a story of a man who does not fight society, but negotiates with it. And that is what makes him Ukrainian's forgotten queer protagonist. There is one scene in the novel that quietly explains everything, and I'd like to discuss it. The Schmidts are sitting at the dinner table. Lahovskyi is not there, and for the first time they speak about him, about his love, about his tenderness, about something that feels wrong. Konstantin, one of the sons, says, I quote it, "He loved us deeply, he was ashamed to speak of it to us, yet even then he loved us just the same, and was ashamed to beg our forgiveness." This is already telling. Love is acknowledged, but it is immediately framed as something embarrassing, something that requires apology. Then the other son, Volodymyr, interrupts. He says, "He loved you, but even that love of his, that tenderness towards my brothers, it all feels uncertain to me. There is something about it, a scent to it, a flavor." And suddenly love becomes suspicion, Not a feeling, but a trace, not a gesture, but a smell, something that cannot be named but must be distanced. Volodymyr reaches for literature to protect himself. He quotes Heine. He remembers lines about men whose love is better avoided when they stand behind you. He does not say homosexual, he does not say desire, he says unhygienic. And that word is devastating because it turns affection into contamination, feeling into danger, intimacy into threat. The mother tries to dismiss it. She says, "You are weaving nonsense." But even she feels that something has already remained, slander, and something will always remain. Apollon, the third brother, reacts with anger. He throws the accusations back. He says, "Look at yourself. Are you not also a very nice boy?" Suddenly, beauty itself becomes suspicious. Suddenly, the body becomes implicated. Volodymyr, the least attractive of the brothers, stays silent. His bitterness does not need words. And then Constantine intervenes. He offers the safest explanation possible. He says he is a poet, an artistic temperament, expressing feelings in a peculiar, often irrational ways. And here is the misreading. Queerness is transformed into aesthetics, desire is transformed into temperament, love is transformed into artistic eccentricity. The group finds a way to save themselves from discomfort. They do not reject Lahovskyi, they reinterpret him. They make him harmless. This is what misreading looks like. Not denial, but translation into something safer. And this is where then meets now, because for decades Ukrainian readers did the same. Lahovskyi was read as hysterical, decadent, neurotic, overly sensitive, morally confused, and artistically unstable, but rarely as a man whose desire had nowhere to go. His love was allowed as long as it remained abstract. His tenderness was acceptable as long as it remained poetic. His suffering was readable as long as it was not called queer. Even today, many readers will still call this novel about friendship, about mentorship, about intellectual bonding. And in a way, they are right, because this is exactly how queerness survived when it had no language. It survived as friendship, as admiration, as devotion, as shame. The dinner table scene shows us not only how Lahovskyi was seen, but how society learned to look away politely, not with hatred, but with reinterpretation. And that is why this novel was not censored, it was misunderstood, and misunderstanding can be a very effective form of erasure. Today we read this scene differently, not because we are smarter, but because we finally have words. And when we return to this table, to this conversation, to this silence, we realize they were already talking about queerness. They just didn't know how to call it, and neither did he. When I think about Andrii Lahovskyi, I don't think only about a queer figure. I think about Ukraine, because his story is not just about desire without language, it is about identity without safety. Lahovskyi lives in a world where everything important must be negotiated quietly. Love, belonging, truth, even self-respect. And that is something deeply Ukrainian. Ukraine has always existed between larger forces, empires, ideologies, borders, languages. We learn to survive not by shouting, but by adjusting, by hiding, by translating ourselves into something acceptable. Andrii does the same. He does not rebel, he does not leave, he does not demand, he adapts. He learns how to be loved only conditionally, how to be accepted only partially, how to exist without fully arriving. This is not weakness, this is historical training. Ukrainian culture is full of characters like him. Sensitive men, strong women, quiet rebels, exhausted thinkers, people who feel too much and act too little. Not because they lack courage, but because courage in Ukraine often had to look like patience. Lahovskyi is not heroic, but he is honest. He shows what it costs to remain human in a culture that constantly asks you to be convenient. That is why queerness in this novel does not look like pride, it looks like endurance. And that endurance is not only queer, it is Ukrainian. Ukraine between the lines is exactly the space, not the slogans, not the monuments, not the official narratives, but the inner negotiations, the compromises, the silent agreements we make with the world in order to stay alive inside it. Lahovskyi teaches us that Ukrainian identity was never simple, never uniform, never purely traditional. It was always fractured, reflective, and painfully self-aware. Our literature is full of people who do not fit and learn to live anyway. And maybe this is the most Ukrainian thing of all, to continue without certainty, without permission, without full acceptance, but with attention, with memory, with a quiet insistence on being real. When we read Andrii Lahovskyi today, we are not just reading a queer story, we are reading a country learning how to look at itself carefully, painfully, and without shortcuts. This is Ukraine between the lines, not loud, not simple, but deeply alive. When I finished the novel, I didn't feel resolved. I felt aware of how many lives were lived without language, how many desires learned to hide inside politeness, how many people survived by becoming smaller than they were. Lahovskyi does not give us a hero, he gives us a human being, a man who loved, a man who hesitated, a man who learned to negotiate with a world that did not know what to do with him. And maybe that is why he stayed with me, because he reminds us that history is not only written by those who fight loudly, but also by those who endure quietly. This novel does not teach us how to be brave, it teaches us how fragile courage can be, and how real. When we read Andrii Lahovskyi today, we are not just giving him a new interpretation, we are giving him something he never had. A reader who can finally see him without needing to correct him, without needing to sanitize him, without needing to turn him into something safer. We are simply allowing him to exist. And maybe that is the smallest and most important form of justice literature can offer. This was Ukraine Between the Lines, and this was the Ukraine's Forgotten Queer Protagonist. Thank you for reading Between the Lines with me.